Welcome to Talk Law Radio with attorney Todd Marquardt of the Marquardt Law Firm at marquardtlawfirm.com.
Welcome to Talk Law Radio. I'm Todd Marquardt, on the radio, on podcasts, on Facebook, and on YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about a new rule that the Justice Department wrote that expands the definition of engaged in business according to the Safer Communities Act that was passed to address the gun violence issue following some mass shootings. So the reason this issue is important to me, and I think it's important to you, is because it's the government regulating our daily lives. And my interest is in expanding freedom and protecting liberty. And that's one of my missions in having the radio show. And I hope to encourage you to reach out to government leaders anytime that you feel like the government is intruding on your rights, your freedoms, your liberty. Other purposes and mission for Talk Law Radio is just for me to go and tell and be a light of how one lawyer, that's me, lives faith. I like to talk about the law and gospel, the gospel from the Bible, and sometimes the law as God made it, and sometimes the law as it's written in municipal, state, and federal statutes. I also like to help you and inspire you to pursue your dreams so that you can create a legally enforceable legacy that can be passed on as an inheritance to your loved ones. And of course, you hear me say all the time that I'm here to help you protect you from your legal issue blind spots by listening to me talk about the law on the radio. And I also like to help you protect your business and your assets and things like that. Show you opportunities for using the assets that you have and the rules and laws to help you protect yourself. I'm also here to remind you of our constitutional rights to defend freedom, exercise liberty, and strengthen the national economy, of which brings prosperity and benefits for all of us. And finally, to promote charity, which benefits mankind worldwide. So I brought with me today my God Bless the USA Bible. I don't have it in front of me, but I did bring it. And the reason is it has written in the back of the Bible the Bill of Rights, which is our first 10 amendments. And the reason I brought that is because the Second Amendment protects our right to keep and bear arms. And that's what we're talking about today, is this rule that was made to eliminate gun shows, essentially. But let me just read for you part of this news release from the Justice Department. It says, the rule seeks to implement provisions of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and provide clarity on who must obtain a license and run background checks. The license they're talking about is the federal firearm license, the license for gun dealers to sell firearms. And you might know if you live in Texas, you might not know if you've just recently arrived, that if you go to a gun show and you set up a table to sell your own firearms, you don't necessarily need a federal firearms license. But don't take it from me. I'm not trying to give legal advice about who should and who should not have a federal firearms license today. If you want specific legal advice about what you should do, you should always have a personal relationship with an attorney. And that reminds me, I should talk about the sponsor of the show. That's Marquardt Law Firm. The attorneys at Marquardt Law Firm focus on business and estate law, including last wills, living trusts, and tax-protected inheritance plans. Also, new businesses and old businesses that might have issues with corporations, contracts, LLCs, family limited partnerships, and we can represent those who are facing problems from lack of planning, like in county court, district court, or probate court. And today we're talking about this new rule that was just signed by the Justice Department. And it says that the new rule is to further define, quote, engaged in the business, end quote, which makes clear the circumstances in which a person is engaged in the business of dealing in firearms and thus required to obtain a federal firearms license. And if you have a federal firearms license, in order to sell a firearm, you have to do a federal background check, unless the person that you're selling to, in Texas anyway, has a concealed carry permit. The concealed carry license is not legally required in order for you to carry a concealed firearm in Texas anymore, because Texas passed a law last legislative session called the constitutional carry law, which in Texas law says that because of the Second Amendment, you already have the right to conceal carry a firearm. But if under federal law, which is regulated by the Gun Control Act, that's when you have to have a federal firearms license in order to deal in firearms, and that's when you're required to conduct federal background checks on people. This press release further says, under this regulation, it will not matter if guns are sold on the internet, at a gun show, or at a brick and mortar store. If you sell guns predominantly to earn a profit, you must be licensed, and you must conduct background checks, said Attorney General Merrick Garland. So this is another part of the regulation, is when it says to earn a profit, quote unquote. That's going to be defined as well. On August 30th, 2023, the Attorney General signed the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, defining engaged in the business as a dealer in firearms. And then there was a period of time when the public could comment. And if you're interested in that process, which we all should be, sorry I didn't give you a heads up on this back in August and September of last year, there's the Justice Department or the ATF put this infographic on their website about the basic rulemaking process. Step 1, the agency creates a draft of the proposed rule. Step 2, the draft proposed rule is reviewed and approved by the agency, in this case the ATF. Step 3, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs of the Office of Management and Budget reviews the draft proposed rule. Step 4, a notice of proposed rulemaking is published in the Federal Register as required by the Administrative Procedures Act. Step 5, at least a 30-day public comment period is open. I think in this case it was 90 days. Step 6, the agency reviews comments and drafts a final rule. Step 7, the agency approves the final draft of the rule within the agency. Step 8, draft final rule is reviewed and approved by under the Office of Management and Budget. Step 9, the final rule is published in the Federal Register, and Step 10, the rule is implemented. So I think that we are somewhere between Step 8 and Step 9, because the final rule has been signed, but it has not yet been published in the Federal Register. I looked up some of these comments on the Federal Register website, and what I found was a whole lot of copies of comments. And I'm going to read the whole thing to you, so hopefully you can stay awake for that. This one is in favor of the rule. It says, "Dear Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, I am writing in support of the ATF's proposed rule, docket number ATF 2022 R-17, which would dramatically reduce the number of guns sold without a background check. I am writing in support of this proposed rule and urge ATF to finalize it as soon as possible. Guns sold without background checks, both online and at gun shows, are a huge source for gun traffickers and people looking to avoid a check. These guns often end up trafficked across state lines, recovered at crime scenes in major cities, and used against police officers. This contributes to the gun violence epidemic plaguing our country. The long-standing lack of clarity around which sellers must become licensed and run background checks has made this problem all the worse. I support the clear common sense standard laid out in this rule. Anyone offering guns for sale online or at a gun show is presumed to be trying to make a profit and should therefore be licensed and run a background check on their customers. This rule will save lives and should be urgently finalized. Sincerely, Ralph Grove." So this has been copied many thousands of times. I'm not sure who distributed this text to the public, but it doesn't seem genuine to me if people just send in the same comment over and over again. It's like propaganda. Well, here's propaganda from the other side, because I found several copies of this. It says, "Gun Owners of America has informed me that ATF has weaponized the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act as a backdoor to enact universal background checks and firearm registration by claiming that hundreds of thousands of gun owners who sell a few personal firearms suddenly now must become federally licensed as gun dealers. The ATF's proposed rule, ATF 2022 R-17, is an unconstitutional and blatantly erroneous interpretation of federal law and must not be finalized. ATF is wrong to suggest a single firearm sale or no sale at all might require a license. ATF's rule claims that the agency has opted not to establish a threshold number of firearm sales per year that require licensure, and instead suggests that even a single firearm transaction or offer to engage in a transaction, when combined with other evidence, may be sufficient to require a license. The statutes enacted by Congress clearly do not intend to regulate the conduct of an individual who merely sells a single firearm. Instead, 18 U.S.C. 921A11, 21, 22, and 23 clearly contemplate regulating someone who regularly and repetitively either manufactures and sells or purchases and resells multiple firearms. ATF fails to protect unlicensed conduct exempted by Congress. Additionally, Congress also expressly exempted occasional sales, exchanges, or purchases of firearms for the enhancement of a personal collection or for a hobby. According to Congress, ATF cannot presume anyone to be engaged in the business of dealing in firearms simply because they sold a few guns on a few occasions. In contrast, ATF's rule provides no such assurances. Wrongfully licensing constitutionally protected activity will lead to warrantless searches and additional constitutional violations. Moreover, by selling a single firearm, unless purportedly coming under the jurisdiction of the ATF as a newly minted gun dealer, private gun owners can now be subject to warrantless searches of their homes and their firearm collections. This is a clear violation of both the Second and Fourth Amendments, and it runs totally contrary to the Supreme Court's Caniglia decision in 2021. That case, the Biden administration fully supported the ability of law enforcement to conduct warrantless searches of firearms in the home as part of a so-called welfare check. But the Supreme Court ruled against the Rhode Island police and the Biden administration with a 9-0 vote. Now the Biden administration is trying to implement warrantless searches through the back door and without even having a vote in Congress. ATF suggests it might deny a license to applicants who the agency ordered to become licensed. One footnote in the proposed rule suggests the ATF might prevent a person from obtaining a license to even engage in future firearm transactions because they were presumed to have willfully engaged in the business of dealing in firearms without a license. Therefore, the agency might warn that individual of their purportedly unlawful behavior. Such an individual, wishing to complete a future firearm transaction without ATF harassment, might submit an application to obtain a license to deal in firearms. But ATF's footnote suggests the law-abiding individual might be denied the license simply because their previous conduct was presumptively unlawful. Thus, law-abiding citizens wishing to avoid any legal gray area created by this ATF rule are damned if they do get a license and damned if they don't. Backdoor universal background check includes universal firearm registration called universal background checks are only enforceable with a gun registry. This rule proposes that private citizens be regulated by the federal government as gun dealers, forcing them to run background checks on every firearm transaction in a backdoor attempt to require private citizens to create, maintain, and eventually turn over these registration papers. Failure to fill out registration paperwork and create a paper trail for even a single firearm transaction will be considered a federal crime. The Biden administration described this as moving the U.S. as close to universal background checks as possible without additional legislation. In fact, I did see that in the press release from the White House. And I continue with this comment from an individual that probably got a copy of the comment from this advocacy organization. And the rule is only enforceable by cannibalizing the existing commercial federal firearms license and background check system into an unconstitutional, illegal gun registration scheme for all firearm sales. But as ATF checks in on private transactions, those who privately transfer a firearm without a license and who do not maintain federal gun registration paperwork will be presumed by ATF to be in non-compliance with the law. As such, this rule exceeds statute and infringes on the constitutional right protected by the Second Amendment. That's a mouthful. I hope that you're still awake. Here's another comment that I found that was much shorter and was uniquely written. It just says, Congress makes laws and Marxists change word meaning to change law. Change Marxist, not law. Thanks. the person who wrote that did not sign their name. Okay. I did find some other interesting comments. See if I can find it here. Oh, from Twitter X. Sharon quoted Old Man Geezer and replied saying, "It's my guess after this, there will be an order secretly given to completely stop issuing the licenses. Just a theory." Thanks, Sharon. Here's another one from In Block Press. A reminder that you can thank Reagan for signing the FOPA, which added a statutory definition of, quote, engaged in the business, end quote, of firearms sales, and is now being skin-suited by the Biden ATF to require private sellers to obtain federal firearms license. So that's an interesting quote. Well, now that you know that this rule is out there, I'm wondering how federal firearms license dealers are going to respond, and wondering how Texas is going to respond. We have a long history of having gun shows, and I've been to some, and I'm wondering when the next gun show is going to be now that this final rule has been signed but not yet published. So I don't think it can be enforced yet. Some other things related to the law that attorneys can help with might be to have a gun trust. As you can see, that the gun laws are getting to be more complex every day, and there is a need for attorney services and attorneys who are experienced in gun law. The firearms ownership and transfer are regulated under both federal and state law. Laws are often confusing and sometimes conflicting, and gun law attorneys are hard to find. But as I've said before, attorneys at Marquardt Law Firm do know about gun law. So if you're interested, you can go to marquardtlawfirm.com and search the website for some articles on gun law, or you can schedule a consultation by chatting on marquardtlawfirm.com or calling 210-530-4278. The National Firearms Act of 1934 is a motivator behind the creation of entities to procure, that is, acquire, purchase federally regulated firearms. So these are firearms that you have to buy a stamp, you have to get your fingerprints and all of that. Machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, silencers, any other weapons, and destructive devices. So any other weapons is actually defined, and it doesn't mean regular type weapons. Anyway, you'll have to look that up or listen to one of my previous shows about this. There's also the Gun Control Act of 1968 that you have to comply with. And just in general, you might remember that firearms are the one type of personal property that you're allowed to have so long as you're not prohibited from having it. If you buy furniture, like a sofa or a painting or dishes or clothing, there's no regulation against prohibited persons having that. But a firearm is the one thing that you're only allowed to have as long as you're not a prohibited person. Prohibited persons are those who are convicted of domestic violence, those who regularly use and abuse narcotics, those who say that they don't want to be a United States citizen anymore, and those who are convicted felons. And there might be others on that list that are not coming to my mind right now. Oh, I was telling you about that FOPA that Reagan signed back in 1986. FOPA stands for Firearms Owners Protection Act. And the engaged in business term there in 18 U.S.C. 921A21C is a person who devotes time, attention, and labor to dealing in firearms as a regular course of trade or business with the principal objective of livelihood and profit through the repetitive purchase and resale of firearms. So that's the issue at hand. So the new rule specifically proposes to clarify when a person is engaged in the business as a dealer in firearms at wholesale or retail by clarifying the definition of dealer and defining the terms purchase and sale as they apply to dealers. I think that this is all the time I have for today. I hope that you've learned something about the new definition and regulation. I'm Todd Marquardt. I'll talk to you later.
This has been Talk Law Radio with attorney Todd Marquardt, brought to you by the Marquardt Law Firm. You can learn more at marquardtlawfirm.com. And be sure to listen to the full Talk Law Radio show Saturday mornings at 11 on 9:30 a.m. The Answer.
Each week, attorney Todd Marquardt talks about the law. His mission with the Talk Law Radio show and podcast is to help you discover your legal issue blind spots. In the beginning, God had one law. Don't eat from the fruit of that tree. Then came the 10 Commandments. Now we have federal, state, and municipal lawmakers that won't stop creating new laws. Laws that might impact you without you knowing it. Listen to the show and drop a line on Facebook or email host@talklawradio.com and let the host know what you think of the show, the topics you want to hear, and whether you want to be a guest.